And there's water for you.
And there's water, thank you. It's actually Brooklyn, even more farther away than Manhattan. Thank you, yeah. I'd like to take a look at the slides. So I want to talk to you a little bit today about character. I wrote an entire book on it. We can have the slides going in the meantime, because I think it's an important issue that we don't talk much about anymore. It used to be a huge deal, as you'll see. The ancient Greeks and Romans were all about character, or lack thereof, when they run into people that didn't have a good character. But recently, character has become a little bit of an either old-fashioned word or even a bad word, because people have rightly shifted emphasis in terms of societal issues to structural issues, right? It's like, it's not all about the individual, it's about the structure. We have a society that's designed in a certain way, and a lot of our problems come from our structures, not from the individuals that live within that structure. That's certainly true, but the two are not mutually exclusive. It doesn't mean that just because we should be changing and improving the structure of society, we shouldn't also try to improve the other side of the equation, which is our own character and the character of our leaders. So, of course, in half an hour or so, I can't really give you the whole book, but I'll give you 5 sort of take-home messages from the book, the basic stuff. So if we can have the next slide. And the one after that. Thank you. So, take-home message number 1, if you're not virtuous, don't get into politics. Well, this may sound like a no-brainer. On the other hand, just look at the political class that we have now, and you'll see why this is actually still good advice. Now, the first one to give that kind of advice explicitly was a guy named Socrates. You might have heard of him. He lived in Athens in about 2,400 years ago, give or take. He's the guy on the right with the angel on his shoulder. That's not really an angel. It's his daimon, in fact, which is root for the English word demon. But daimons in ancient Greece were not necessarily evil. Some of them were evil and some of them were good. So this is basically a way to depict Socrates' conscience. It's its guiding light. That's why it's out there. And he's talking to a fellow named Alcibiades. And Alcibiades is one of the least appreciated in terms of consequences, individuals of the ancient world. Not many people have heard of him, and I don't know why people have not actually already made a movie or a television series out of his life, because he was like incredible. He was impossibly handsome, uber rich, from one of the most noble families in Athens, dashing, courageous. It was like everything. So naturally, he wanted to get into politics. Like, I need to, with all these things in my favor, what am I going to do next? So the book, the second chapter in the book, starts out with this scene that I'm going to set up for you. This is about 430 BCE, and a young Alcibiades, he's about 20 years old, goes to see Socrates. The two are friends. Alcibiades is also Socrates' student and rumored lover. At the time, that was a normal thing, student-mentor relationships. Although, as it turns out, it's Alcibiades who really wanted to have sex with Socrates, not the other way around. We know this from a Platonic dialogue called the Symposium. Now, to set the stage, the Peloponnesian War had just started. That was the long, protracted, several decades long war between Athens and Sparta, which eventually ended up with the defeat of Athens and the fact that Sparta was so weakened that by the end of the Peloponnesian War, the Macedonians came down from the north, Philip the Macedon and Alexander the Great, and just swept the whole thing. The Greek states were left essentially without the ability to defend themselves because they had run out of everything, men, weapons, and all sorts of things over those 30 plus years of war. But here we're just at the beginning, and things are going actually fairly well for Athens at the moment. So Alcibiades goes to Socrates and asks for advice. He says, should I get into politics or not? Next. And, oh, actually, I meant next as in there should be a second part of that slide. Never mind, that's okay, you can leave it there. So Alcibiades goes to Socrates, they have basically an interview, a job interview, where Socrates says, so tell me, what would you do as a leader in Athens? And it turns out a few minutes into the interview, we have essentially transcripts from this interview in a dialogue called the Alcibiades-Meyer by Plato. And a few minutes later, it's pretty clear that Alcibiades is just not the kind of person that should go into politics. He's self-centered, he's a narcissist, he cares only about his own glory. And so it's like Socrates says, no, that's just not going to happen. And this is from the dialogue. Socrates says, alas, Alcibiades, what a condition you suffer from. I hesitate to name it, but it must be said. You are wedded to stupidity, best of men, of the most extreme sort, as the argument accuses you and you accuse yourself. So this is why you are leaping into the affairs of the city before you've been educated. Ouch. Right. The kind of stupidity that Socrates is talking about is really lack of wisdom. The Greek word there is amatia, which means lack of wisdom. So it's not that Alcibiades is stupid in the normal sense of the word. He's not an idiot. In fact, on the contrary, he's quite a smart person. But he lacks wisdom, and so he directs his intelligence into the wrong places and in wrong ways. And so Socrates tells him to get out of that business. Of course, Alcibiades thinks it over and then decides to get into politics anyway. And the result is a disaster for both himself and from Athens. Next slide. So about a couple of decades later, Alcibiades is killed by a number of Persian spies sent by the Spartans to eliminate him. In the meantime, he had had an incredible life. As I said, they should do a movie out of it. He was named general in Athens and then recalled because he was accused of impiety, disrespect for the gods. He therefore defects and goes to Sparta. He starts advising the Spartans against the Athenians very effectively. But then he has an affair with the Spartan queen and gets her pregnant. The Spartan king did not appreciate this kind of thing. So Alcibiades has to leave Sparta as well. So where does he go now? It's both the major powers of, he's had enough dealings with both of them. So he goes to Persia, which was the third big power in the Mediterranean at the time. And he starts advising the Persians against both the Spartans and the Athenians. And then somehow the Athenians want him back, and he goes back. And he comes back on top of things again. He wins a number of battles for Athens. And then at some point, the Athenians again get tired of his character and his self-aggrandizing, and send him away. And eventually he gets he's in the mountains trying to hide from the people that are sent to kill him. He's surrounded, his house is surrounded. He comes out, as you can see there in that beautiful painting, naked with his shield in one hand and a sword in the other hand, crying his battle cry, and people are so afraid of him that nobody dares engaging him in open combat. And so they kill him from a distance with spears and arrows. Turns out Socrates was right. It was a bad idea for Alcibiades to go into politics. But not only that, Socrates actually turns out, if you look at the dialogues by another one of his friends and students, Xenophon, Socrates made actually a habit of advising people whether to go or not to go into politics. And more often than not, he gets it right. There are some people that listen to him, don't go into politics, and sure enough, they live a good life. Other people that do listen to him and go into politics, and they actually are effective. So sometimes Alcibiades is presented as one of Socrates' major failures, but he wasn't. Socrates turned out to be correct. It was Alcibiades that didn't listen to the advice. So the general idea, therefore, is that character matters. What your objectives are, how you behave to other people, and for what reasons matters, especially if you're getting into statesmanship politics. The second message from the book is that virtue can and should be taught. That's a picture that I took in Western Turkey, in Ephesus, that is a statue of virtue personified. Next. So there are a number of examples that I want to show you about, when we're talking about the concept of virtue, what is it exactly that we're talking about? Yes, next. Thank you. So prudence, there are 4 cardinal virtues in ancient Greek and Roman philosophy, which are still relevant today. Prudence, which is sometimes referred to as practical wisdom, is the notion of, it's the knowledge of what is good and what is not good, what is therefore that you need to pursue and what you need to stay away from. What Alcibiades lacked was, among other things, prudence. He didn't know, he was confused. He thought that self-aggrandizing and personal glory are good things. And it, on the other hand, didn't realize that it's the good of other people and the good of your city that is actually something to pursue. So if you don't know, basically, if you don't have prudence, if you don't have practical wisdom, your moral compass is completely screwed up. You don't know what your priorities ought to be. Next. The second one is justice, understood not as we understand it today as a sort of a general theory of justice and how to treat other people, but as a personal character trait. So to be just for the Greco-Romans just meant to be fair to other people, to be to treat other people as you would like to be treated. Next. The third one is fortitude or courage. This is not courage, the courage to get into battle. Alcibiades had a lot of that, but that wasn't the problem. The problem is this is the courage to do the right thing even though it may cost you at a personal level, either as an inconvenience or as, something a little bigger than that. Next. And then temperance, self-control, the ability to do things in the right measure, neither too much nor too little. The notion that the Greco-Romans had was that if you follow these 4 virtues, you're training yourself to become a good person. You practice them on a regular basis. If you are about to make a decision about whether to do something or not do something, then you should be asking yourself if this is the prudent, just, courageous, and temperate thing to do. And if the answer is yes, you do it. If the answer is no, you don't do it. Right? Next. Now, the word virtue itself comes from the Latin virtus, but the Latin virtus was simply a translation of the Greek arete, and arete means excellence. So to be virtuous just means to be excellent at something. The reason there is that ominous-looking knife over there is because the word virtue for the Greeks doesn't apply just to human beings. It applies to everything that has a function. If I go, a few days ago, I went with my wife and got a new bread knife, and we wanted an arete bread knife, an excellent bread knife. How do you define a virtuous bread knife? Well, it's a bread knife that cuts as it's supposed to, right? That it's not blunt, that it does the job in correct manner. So for a human being, to be arete just means to do the job of a human being in the correct manner. And what the heck is that? Next. Essentially, you find the answer in the very root of the word ethics or morality. Ethics comes from the Greek ethos, which was then translated by the Roman Cicero into morales, which is the root, of course, for the English morality. So ethics and morality are the same thing as far as the Greco-Romans are concerned. They're just one is a translation of the other. And both words have to do with character and social living. So in other words, when you are being ethical or moral, what it means is that you developed a good pro-social way of interacting with other human beings. That's it. That's all what it is about. Next. Right? So an excellent human being is a moral human being. Why? Because morality really at bottom is the problem of how to live constructively and cooperatively with other human beings. We are a social species. Our survival and our flourishing depends on the fact that we interact positively with other people. And so if we understand that, it is the rational thing to do, to behave pro-socially, to behave cooperatively toward other people. And that is what it means to be moral in the Greco-Roman sense of the term. But can we teach virtue? That's the big question, right? Can we teach it to politicians? Can we teach it to ourselves? Can we teach it to our kids? Socrates, at one point, is a little skeptical about it. He says, well, I don't know, if virtue were the kind of thing that you could teach, then I would see a lot of teachers of virtue out there, but I don't see anybody who's capable of teaching virtue. In fact, on the contrary, I look at people that are virtuous, like Pericles, who was the guy in charge at Athens at the time, and his sons are really scoundrels. They're really not good people. And you would think that if anybody were able to teach virtue to somebody else, it would be parents to their children. I don't see a lot of examples of those, says Socrates, so I'm a little skeptical. But then he has a conversation with one of the sophists, a guy named Protagoras, and Protagoras changes Socrates' mind about this thing. What Protagoras points out is that virtue is not a theoretical thing. It's not like mathematics that you teach to people and you sit them down and say, okay, here it is, and here how it works, and this is your assignment for home, and then if you do the assignment, you learn mathematics. It's a practical skill. It's a technique in Greek. Next. So it's a lot like learning a musical instrument. How do you learn a musical instrument? You need three things. You do need a little bit of theory. You want to know something about music, the different notes and how they relate to each other, because otherwise you're just going randomly and not making much sense. You do want, if you're lucky enough, you do want a good teacher, because the teacher will point out where you're making mistakes, you'll point out, give you suggestion on how to improve and all that sort of stuff. But fundamentally, the most important thing you need is practice, 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 practice. Right? So you start with simple scales and you get more complicated, simple tunes, more complicated. That's how you get a Carnegie Hall, right? Practice. So it's the same with virtue. You do need a little bit of theory. I just gave you some of the theory. The 4 cardinal virtues, for instance, are part of the theory. You do need, if you can get it, you need a teacher. Socrates is not around anymore, but there are books written about him where you can actually learn quite a bit, and there are other people out there that are trying to do something similar. But mostly you need to be mindful every day, every hour of your life, and ask yourself, am I doing things in the right way? Am I actually following the moral compass that is identified by the virtues? Because if you're not, you can correct yourself and say, okay, well, I need to do this. And the more you do it, the more second nature it becomes, and that's how you teach yourself or other people virtue. Next. Message number 3, a good character is an inside job. Character is something that is being studied actually by psychologists these days. It used to be just the province of philosophers, but now science is getting into the business of studying character. In fact, I'll give you a few hints about how to practically improve your character near the end of this talk that come from both ancient Greco-Roman philosophy and science. So we start knowing quite a bit about what does it mean to have a good character, how does character work. And character traits are basically behavioral attitudes, behavioral dispositions. If you say that your friend is, let's say, generous, what does that mean? It means that other things being equal, although not necessarily every single time, your friend will behave in a generous fashion, right? So she will devote time to people, out of kindness of her heart, or she would give money to people or something like that, right? That's what it means. To have a character trait, a virtue of some sort, is simply to have an inclination to behave in a certain way. Now, that inclination is mostly something that you have to be convinced that you want to practice. People cannot impose it on you from the outside. Remember the analogy with music. You can force a kid to learn the piano. It won't work unless the kid wants to learn how to play the piano. You can nudge him or give him the tools, the advice, and everything else. But unless the kid is actually interested in playing the piano, it's not going to go very, very far. The same, as it turns out, goes for character. The book has a number of chapters in the middle of it where I examine historical examples of people who have been taught, or at least where people have tried to teach statesmen and politicians how to behave better, as distinct from examples where politicians themselves, statesmen themselves, were convinced that it was a good idea to practice philosophy, and so they took it up on their own, and see what the difference is. These examples are all not good. They're all failures. They all didn't work. Plato tried twice with Dionysius I and Dionysius II of Syracuse. He actually went from Athens to Syracuse when he was in his 60s and then again in his 70s. He did, engage in a perilous voyage on the Mediterranean, went to Syracuse with the idea of teaching virtue to the tyrant. Tyrant at the time was not necessarily a bad thing, it was simply the guy in charge. And in one case, he was sold into slavery. As a result, his friends had to pay a ransom to get him out. And in the second one, he was put to house arrest. It didn't work. Seneca, the Roman senator from the 1st century, tried with his pupil. Unfortunately, his pupil was the Emperor Nero. And you all know probably how that ended up, with Socrates being invited eventually to commit suicide by Nero. So those didn't work. Why not? Because those are all cases where the person that was being taught had absolutely no interest in learning. And as I sometimes tell my students at City College, I can explain it to you, but I cannot learn it for you. Right? It's up to you. Next. Now, an example where things went a little better was Aristotle and his relationship with Alexander the Great. A little better because Alexander was young. He was in 16 or 17 when Aristotle started teaching him. And that's early enough to still make a difference. But more importantly, because Alexander actually genuinely was there to learn. He really wanted to learn from Aristotle. In fact, throughout the rest of his life, Alexander went around, for instance, with a copy of Homer Iliads that was personally annotated by Aristotle because he thought that he had it under his pillow together with a dagger. So he thought that two ways to survive his campaigns were to be armed with an actual weapon and then to be armed with the wisdom of Homer and Aristotle. So he actually wanted to learn, and things went much better. Next. But the best examples are from these people: Cicero, the Roman senator at the end of the Republic, Cato the Younger, another Roman senator, also was a colleague and friend of Cicero, Dion of Syracuse, who was the third guy that Plato really was insistent. He tried again. He tried a third time. And this time he succeeded with a guy named Dion, also in Syracuse. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor from the 2nd century, and Julian, one of the last, in fact, the last Roman pagan emperor, which is why he is known as the apostate, because the Christians didn't like him. Now, all of these are cases where the statesman himself, the person himself, wanted to learn and set out to learn how to become a better person. They did, all of these sought help from philosophers, but they did it on their own. They wanted to do it. And the results, in all cases, are far better than the first group. Next. Number 4. We should all be philosophers, but note the scare quotes. Not philosophers as that guy over there. I don't know how many people here have watched the Good Place, excellent series in my mind, which features philosophy prominently, as you know if you watched it. But Chidi from The Good Place is really an example, a bad example of practical philosopher, because he's so much into theory, so much into exploring the different nuances of one thing or another that he can never make a decision, right? He's always undecided. My very favorite episode is the one where they deal with the trolley dilemma. Right, so he's talking about these hypothetical situations in philosophy that are used to teach people about right and wrong, and so he's explaining to the other characters about the fact, there's a trolley and the trolley is going that way, the brakes are not working, that way it's going to kill 5 people, but you have the power to pull a lever, and if you pull the lever, it's going to go on over there, killing 1 person, what would you do? And, he's involved into this discussion, and one of the other characters, the one played by Dan Denson, says, okay, let's try this in practice. So he snaps his fingers because he is a supernatural entity, and all of a sudden everybody is actually on a trolley going down and actually killing five people, and of course Chidi freaks out. This thing is repeated several times, and every time he ends up killing everybody because he can't make up his mind. So Chidi is not what I mean by a practical philosopher. What I do mean is what the ancient Greco-Romans meant. The word philosopher simply meant somebody who was seeking wisdom. Not who had attained wisdom, that's a sage, but who was seeking wisdom. And so even though the most famous philosophers, of course, are people like Socrates on the other side of the screen, everybody who actually decided to live mindfully, trying to become a better person, trying to act in the proper way, that was a philosopher. Okay? So in that sense, we all need to be philosophers. Next. And how do you become a philosopher? How are you a philosopher in that sense? Next. Well, you use, as I said before, the 4 cardinal virtues as a moral compass, or whatever other thing works. I mean, the cardinal virtues are the Greco-Roman tradition. Turns out that different traditions use different devices, but it's the same basic idea. More. You try as much as possible to improve yourself from an ethical perspective. For instance, practicing something called, referred to often in the literature as spiritual exercises. Spiritual exercises are things like mindfully decide to practice, let's say, generosity. How would you do that? Well, let's say that you recognize you're not as generous as you could be, or you want to be. Then you might decide to do something like, for the next month, every Monday morning I'm gonna get up, put some change in my pockets, and then give it to the first homeless person in the street, no questions asked. Something that initially might make you feel a little uncomfortable. That's not the kind of stuff you normally do, but you start doing it. And then as a result of a conscious decision, and then the more you do it, the more it actually becomes comfortable, the more it becomes second nature. And after a while, you don't even think about it. You get the change and you give it to somebody. That sort of stuff. Next. And then one other thing that this tradition in practical philosophy advises is to practice what the Stoics call the fundamental rule of life. The fundamental rule of life is reminding yourself that some things are up to you and other things are not up to you, and that a good life consists in focusing on the first and taking the second as they come. If you have heard of the Serenity Prayer, for instance, which is often said at the beginning of meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous and similar organizations, that's pretty much the same concept. Right? The Serenity Prayer asks God to give you the wisdom to tell the difference between what you can change and what you cannot change, the courage to change what you can, and the serenity to accept what you cannot. Essentially, that's the fundamental rule of life, which way predates the Serenity Prayer. It goes back to Epictetus, who was a early second century Stoic, but it's actually found in other traditions, for instance, in Buddhism as well as in Judaism. Next. And then number 5, the last insight. What works and what doesn't work when it comes to changing your character. There are a lot of, as I said before, there's a lot of research at this point on character, and a lot of this research, interestingly, confirms the intuitions of the Greco-Romans. This is not surprising. The Greco-Romans were very good observers of human character, and they were essentially intuitive psychologists. Today, of course, we have data supporting those intuitions, right, and modifying, tweaking those intuitions. But here's what doesn't work. Next. And what does work. Let's start with what does not work. Doing nothing. That might not be surprising, but sometimes you hear things like, oh, you get wiser as you get older. No, you don't. You get crankier as you get older, unless you're paying attention, right? So if you are paying attention to your experiences, you're mindfully trying to learn from your experiences, then you're getting older and wiser. But if you just let life go by and not paying attention, then you're just getting crankier, not wiser. Next. Virtue labeling doesn't work. We've been taught over the last several years to tell, especially our kids, oh, you're so brilliant, you're so good, you're so here, even though they're not. Turns out it doesn't actually work. It doesn't have any long-term effects other than actually setting up those kids for expectations that they're going to fail and they're going to be feeling miserable about. So don't do that. Don't tell somebody that they're good when they're not. Nudging. Nudging is a very effective behavioral modification technique if you want to manipulate other people, but not if you want to improve their character. You probably know, you've heard of examples of nudging. These are things like you sign up with a new employer, for instance, and the employer has a default situation that where you sign up, you're automatically enrolled in a pension plan and a healthcare plan. You don't have to sign up separately. Why? Because people are lazy, and so if you leave it to them, they won't do it. But if it's by default, obviously it's gonna happen. So in fact, if you don't want to sign up, you have to make the effort and file the paperwork. That does work. It turns out that in fact the people that sign up for healthcare and pension benefits and stuff like that is higher if you make it default as opposed to asking them to do it. My favorite example of nudging is one that half of this room more or less will recognize. If you go to a lot of men's bathrooms in the airports, you will find that all the urinals have this little fly drawn in a certain place on the urinal. That's so that people actually hit the fly and don't make a mess when they go to the bathroom. Believe it or not, men do need that sort of stuff. It works. But why doesn't it work in terms of teaching virtue, becoming a better person? Because those are manipulative techniques. You don't do it because you want to do it, because you think it's the right thing to do. You do it because other people trick you into do it. And so nudging doesn't actually work as a way to improve character. Next. What does work? Well, at least three things. One, adopting role models, which is something that the ancients knew very well. Here's Seneca from a letter that he wrote to his friend Lucilius. Choose therefore a Cato, that's the same Cato that I mentioned earlier, than one of the Roman senators. Or if Cato seems too severe a model, choose some Lelius, a gentle spirit. Choose a master whose life, conversation, and soul-expressing face have satisfied your picture, and you picture him always to yourself as your protector or your pattern. For we must indeed have someone according to whom we may regulate our characters. You can never straighten that which is crooked unless you use a ruler. I love that last sentence. So the notion is you pick a role model. That's not a person who is perfect, because there's no such thing as perfection. It's just a person that you admire for their character and that you wish to use as a role model. In my case, for instance, my adoptive grandfather is one of my role models. He was that kind of person. And so whenever I look at my own behavior, I say, well, here's my grandfather, what am I? This is the ruler that is straight. How crooked am I by comparison? Right? And so you try, okay, then I can nudge myself this way. Nudge not in this way that I said earlier. Next. Avoid or put yourself to the test on purpose when it comes to your character. Here's Epictetus, the 2nd century Stoic, who says, provoked by the sight of a handsome man or a beautiful woman, you will discover within you the contrary power of self-restraint. Faced with pain, you will discover the power of endurance. If you're insulted, you will discover patience. In time, you will grow to be confident that there is not a single impression that you will not have the moral means to tolerate. An impression is a judgment that we make about things, and therefore how to act or not to act on them. So the notion here is to expose yourself or to stay away on purpose, depending on how confident you feel, from situations that are ethically problematic. For instance, what Epictetus notice that the first example there is, a handsome man or a beautiful woman. So let's say that a colleague of yours invites you over for dinner, and it's clear that this is going to be a flirtatious situation, but you are married, you are in a nice relationship, you have a trustful partner, etc., etc. You have a choice. You can either go and say to yourself, I'll be good. I'm not going to yield to any kind of temptation. I'm just going to have a nice dinner. This is a colleague. That's the end of the story. Or you can say, okay, you can politely decline, therefore not even exposing yourself to the possibility. I highly recommend the second, because almost every time we tell ourselves, oh, I can do this, it turns out we can't, right? All it takes is a couple of, glasses of wine, and then all your resolve is gone, and then you're going to regret it the following day. Next. And finally, paying attention, which again seems one of those trivial things, like, yeah, of course you want to pay attention to things. But as it turns out, not enough people do it, and they don't do it in the right way. Here's Epictetus again, admit not sleep into your tender eyelids, till you have reckoned up each deed of the day. How have I erred, what done or left undone? So start and review your acts, and then for vile deeds, chide yourself. For good, be glad. What is he talking about? He's referring to something called a philosophical journaling technique, which is actually recommended also by cognitive behavioral therapists these days. Basically, what you do is, just as Epictetus is saying there, before your tender eyelids close for the night, so before you go to bed, take a few minutes, open up a actual journal if you have it, if actual writing instrument, or your laptop or your iPad, whatever the heck you use, and reflect for a few minutes on what happened during the day that was ethically interesting, salient, something you can learn from. Let's say a friend of yours or a colleague got upset or did something, you got upset, you got angry or something like that. Write that down. But write it down in the following way. First of all, not using emotional language, using as analytic language as possible, because the point is not to relive the potentially painful experience. The point is to learn from it. So you want to write about it in a detached fashion, as if you were an analyst. Second, try to write that in the second person, not in the first person. So instead of saying, I did this and I got angry, blah, 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 say that you did this and you got angry, as if you were writing to a friend. There's very good evidence from modern science that if you do those two things, use analytical language and the second person, it's going to be much easier for you to learn from your experience and then file it away, instead of reliving the experience and getting upset about it and then doing it again. And notice the three questions that Epictetus is asking himself. What kind of mistake have I made, basically? What have I done right? And what have I left undone, meaning something that I could be doing better the next time. It's all about paying attention. You pay attention to your own reactions. You learn from your own reactions, and that's how you improve your character. Next. And that's it. Thanks very much for your attention.